So this is a review of the GameStop G3 controller for the Nintendo GameCube. This was sold when GameCubes were still in the store. The reason you might be interested in this is that the real deal, a genuine Nintendo controller, can be very expensive, especially if it's in good condition, whereas these GameStop controllers can sell for $10, $15, or the worst, $20. Now, you might think, hold on, I can buy a brand new generic controller for less than that, maybe even $5 if I'm really working hard to find the cheapest price. And this is not going to work because these generic controllers are just the worst. In particular, I found that the analog stick is not really analog. So they don't respond to small movements, and then when they do respond, it's like you jammed it all the way over to the full range of motion. So these are really binary sticks, not analog sticks. And that's just an awful way to play any sort of game. So don't buy these. But maybe consider buying one of these. This controller was sold by GameStop, not necessarily the best brand in the world, but as it turns out, of course it wasn't made by them. It's really just a Pelican G3 controller rebranded for GameStop. I mean, look at that. It's just completely identical. I mean, that's not hugely surprising, right? They probably preferred that you could tell who made it, since GameStop is not going to be by itself necessarily a brand that you're going to trust. So I can confirm that these two perform pretty much the same. I've played with them side by side, but since if you've already played with one of these, you probably don't need me to tell you how they behave. Let's compare them to the original. The shape is basically very similar. Maybe small differences, but nothing that you can really notice. So I wouldn't worry about that. Let's worry about how the controls work, because that's obviously way more important. And first off, the analog stick does work properly on this. In other words, a small movement gives you a small response, and a big movement makes your character move at maximum speed. So that's good. The sticks are a little bit different in terms of their design. This one's kind of like a PS2 controller in terms of the rubbery texture on it, but I find that they are pretty much the same. Maybe even this one might be better in terms of keeping your thumb on there without undue force. The C-stick is really different. There's no rubber at all. It's just a concave thing to put your finger on, but I find that they're pretty much the same. I think the GameCube one is just a hair better, but you're not going to really be bothered by this. The face buttons, the GameStop controller, it's a bit more tactile. The original controller, it's a little softer. I think this is actually preferable. It's not too much force. The travel is nice and clean, and you really can feel it. You push the button. This basically goes on to be true for all of the buttons. So every single button on the original controller is a little soft, and on the GameStop controller, they're nice and tactile, but not too hard to push. You can see the shape is just a tiny bit different for some of these buttons. They're not as fat, but I don't really notice. The Z button, I think this is actually nicer on the GameStop. I've always thought the Z button on the Genuine Edition is just a little bit mushy. It doesn't really feel super responsive. And this is, you can hear it. It's got a nice click to it. Trigger buttons on the real deal, they're just so nice. They're so smooth. No resistance except for the spring. You can just depress them exactly the amount that you want, and then the satisfying click at the end. Let's look at that on here. There's a little bit more wiggle maybe, but it's equally smooth. There's no extra resistance from the controller rubbing up against the travel of the button. This is good. I'm happy with it. There's a turbo button on the GameStop controller, but I never bothered to figure it out. There is one area in which the GameStop controller is not as good, which is the D-pad. Honestly, the D-pads aren't great on the original controllers either, so they're a little mushy, and I feel like that's true with the GameStop controller too. It's a little hard on both of them to be able to get just one direction in isolation. Sometimes you push to the left and you get a little up action too. That's really not so much of an issue. I feel like these D-pads are more used for selecting items or traversing menus than for like actual heart-pounding action sequences. But if you're planning to play a game where this does actually need to be the best, then you can do better with the original gamepad. Not great, but better. So in conclusion, the GameStop controller, it's a good alternative to the real deal. I would definitely use it. I definitely do use it, and I'm satisfied with it. So I think that if you're not a purist and you want to save some or even a lot of money, this GameStop controller is a good choice. And like I said, I've had a couple of these controllers. This Pelican one here is obviously the same thing, and they both work pretty well. The only area that I have noticed is that these buttons up here, they have a spring design that can break sometimes. And when they do, there's this piece of metal that gets released, and then when you shake it, you can hear it rattling around. And a piece of metal floating free inside of your game controller is not a great thing. In particular, it's certainly possible for it to short things out. So if that happens, what I've observed is that the controller just starts to rumble the moment you plug it in, and it can even destroy the controller. In fact, this controller doesn't work any longer because of that particular issue. So if you buy one of these things and it rattles, take it apart and find that little metal spring. It's more of a sort of a V shape like that that gets depressed when you push the button, and you need to get that out of there or repair it with a little bit of glue because it's a time bomb. So I think the conclusion is that there's definitely options for people who want to save a little cash and aren't just completely set on having the exact official Nintendo experience, and that option is these. In particular, I've also looked at this Mad Catz third-party controller and found it to be very disappointing. So the hope for future generations is Pelican/GameStop.